If you've never heard a restaurant die before opening, it sounds like champagne flutes breaking in the dark. That was the first thing I thought when I stepped out of my truck at 5:12 that morning and felt the cold stink of exposed lake mud hit the back of my throat. The air should have smelled like cedar, wet stone, and early spring water, the way it always had on my family's lake. But instead it reeked of churned silt, spilled fuel, and fresh paint baking under floodlights that were still buzzing over a disaster no one in this county was supposed to see until sunset. Out in front of me, the floating restaurant the HOA had bragged about for 6 straight weeks wasn't floating anymore. It was listing hard to the left, half sunken into black muck, strings of patio lights drooping like dead vines, white tablecloths flapping in the wind, and a gold banner stretched across the entry rail that read "Grand Opening Tonight," as if the lake itself hadn't already answered that invitation with a flat no. Men in polo shirts were shouting over each other on the dock. A catering van sat crooked in the gravel lot, with its back doors open. Somewhere metal scraped metal with a long, ugly squeal. And standing at the edge of my shoreline in a cream blazer that probably cost more than my first fishing boat, Brenda Collins had one hand clamped around her phone and the other pointed at the wreck like she thought she could command the water to climb back up and fix her mistake. Brenda was the president of our HOA, the kind of woman who smiled with every tooth when a camera was around and talked about community vision, like those 2 words gave her the right to put a price tag on anything pretty. What she didn't know, what none of the board members knew when they sent out glossy mailers calling this place Moonlight Cove Floating Bistro, was that this lake had never belonged to the neighborhood, no matter how many picnic tables they built near it, no matter how many times they called it a shared amenity, and no matter how loudly Brenda repeated that lie at meetings until people stopped asking questions. This water was private. It had been private since my grandfather bought the acreage, hand-surveyed the boundary, and carved the overflow controls into the original deed long before the first HOA sign ever went up on the highway. I knew every inch of that shoreline, every old post, every depth marker, every groan the dock made in a north wind, and most important, I knew what sat behind a locked steel panel tucked under a cedar overhang on the east bank. 3 hours earlier, with the stars still out and the geese restless in the reeds, I'd stood there with my hand on a cold iron wheel my grandfather taught me to respect when I was 12 years old. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch their restaurant. I didn't have to, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens or shouting. Sometimes it slips out in silence, 6 feet of water at a time, and by sunrise, everybody can see exactly who built their dream on something that was never theirs. By the time Brenda realized the lake was not some decorative blue square on an HOA brochure, the damage to her fantasy was already done. I stood there with my boots sinking half an inch into the damp shoreline, listening to the low hum of generators, the hiss of angry whispers, and the wet sucking sound of pontoon floats settling into mud that had been hidden under 6 feet of water the night before. Nobody looked at me at first. They were too busy trying to save centerpieces, folding chairs, and stacks of polished menus that had started curling at the edges in the morning air. The whole thing had the smell of a rushed wedding and a failed county fair all at once, expensive perfume mixing with diesel, lake grass, and fresh lumber. And standing in the middle of it, Brenda Collins was still trying to act like she was in control. She kept snapping her fingers at contractors, pointing at the exposed lake bed like it had personally insulted her, demanding to know who had touched the water level, who had authorized this, who was going to pay for it. I remember the exact second she finally saw me. Her face changed in a way I will never forget. Not panic. Not yet. First came recognition, then irritation, then that polished little smile she used whenever she thought she could talk her way over a problem without actually understanding it. She stepped off the dock in those spotless beige heels, picking her way around extension cords and overturned flower boxes, and stopped about 10 feet from me with her phone still in one hand. "Ethan," she said, like we were neighbors chatting over a fence instead of standing at the edge of a public embarrassment she had floated onto my private property. "Do you know anything about this?" It was almost funny hearing her ask it that way, because Brenda had spent the last month acting like I was invisible unless she needed someone to blame. I looked past her at the restaurant, at the fake lanterns swaying over tables no one would sit at, and I thought about how many times I had tried to stop this before sunrise ever had to do the talking for me. I had sent the certified letter. I had emailed the board. I had dropped off copies of the deed, the survey map, and the county records showing the water control rights belonged to my family and had never been transferred. I had even shown up in person to one of their Thursday meetings in that freezing clubhouse with the bad fluorescent lights and the coffee that tasted like cardboard, and Brenda had smiled at me in front of everyone and said I was confused about historical access traditions. Historical access traditions. That was the phrase she used to turn theft into policy. A week later, they pounded support pilings into the shallows anyway. 2 days after that, they ran temporary power lines across the bank near my east fence. By the time the sign for Moonlight Cove Floating Bistro went up at the neighborhood entrance, people were taking pictures like it was some luxury attraction instead of a trespass with table service. Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. She just believed nobody would make her stop. That was her real mistake. It was never the restaurant. It was never even the dock. It was the way she stood on land my grandfather paid for, over water my father protected, and decided that if she wrapped her greed in enough community language, the truth would stop matching. So when she looked at me that morning, waiting for me to deny what I had done or lose my temper in front of her crew, I gave her neither. I just looked her in the eye, listened to a champagne bottle roll off the tilted deck and crack somewhere in the mud, and said, "I told you this lake had an owner. You just did not think it would matter until the water was gone." Brenda did not flinch the way normal people do when reality finally corners them. She straightened her blazer, tucked one strand of hair behind her ear, and gave me that same look she always used at board meetings, the one that said she believed confidence could replace facts if she held eye contact long enough. Around us, her little grand opening was coming apart inch by inch. A server in black slacks was trying to keep a tray of glassware from sliding off a prep table. One of the caterers muttered something under his breath as he stepped over a power cable half buried in the muck. The restaurant itself let out a low wooden groan as its weight shifted again, and every person on that dock turned for half a second, like they all understood at once that this was no longer an inconvenience. It was exposure. Brenda lowered her voice when she spoke to me next, which somehow made it worse. She asked whether I had any idea how much money had gone into this project, as if the size of her budget was supposed to erase the property line. I told her money did not create ownership. She smiled without warmth and said the board had approved the build, the neighborhood supported it, and the county had no issue with improvements that benefited the community. That was when I realized she still thought this was a debate. She still thought if she stacked enough official-sounding words in the right order, she could turn my family lake into her talking point. I looked out over the exposed shoreline and remembered being 8 years old, sitting in my father's aluminum john boat while he pointed at the old cedar markers along the bank. He used to say water fooled people. Land looked permanent, but water made them careless. They saw a calm surface and imagined it belonged to whoever was bold enough to use it. That was why he taught me every boundary before he taught me how to run a motor. That was why my grandfather had the overflow system tied to the deed itself. They knew that one day somebody would look at that lake and mistake beauty for availability. Brenda was just the first person arrogant enough to build a business plan on that mistake. I told her she should have read the survey instead of her own press release. Her jaw tightened for the first time. Then she held up her phone and said she had attorneys, permits, vendors, investors, and a full launch scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. And if I had interfered with a community asset, she would make sure I regretted it. Community asset. There it was again. She said it like repetition turned theft into policy. Behind her, one of the decorative lantern poles tilted another few inches, and a line of tiny bulbs flickered against the gray morning like the place was trying to stay glamorous while sinking into embarrassment. I could hear a local reporter near the parking area asking one of the contractors what happened, and suddenly Brenda heard it too. Her expression shifted. Not because she understood the law, because she understood optics. That was the first crack. She stepped closer and asked me, very carefully this time, whether I had documentation proving what I was claiming. I almost laughed. Documentation was the only reason I was still standing there calm while her dream bled out into the reeds. I had copies in my truck. I had originals in a fireproof safe. I had certified mail receipts, county maps, historical filings, and a chain of title older than her subdivision. But I did not hand her any of that yet. I wanted the morning to keep teaching her what arrogance costs before paper made it official. So I said, "Brenda, I did not come here to argue. I came here because I knew the truth would look better once the water moved. The reporter's voice carried over the parking lot before I ever saw her face. It cut through the generator hum, the nervous chatter, the scrape of furniture being dragged off the listing platform. And for the first time that morning, Brenda looked like she understood the difference between a private argument and a public collapse. That was the thing about people like her. They could survive a complaint, a warning, even a legal notice if they thought it would stay buried in email threads and board minutes. But once somebody with a camera started asking simple questions in front of witnesses, the whole performance got harder to maintain. Brenda turned halfway toward the lot, then back to me, doing the math in real time. I could almost see her deciding which lie would sound the cleanest on television. The smell of coffee from a catering urn drifted across the dock, and mixed with wet clay and electrical heat from a spotlight still aimed at a dining deck that had already sunk too far to use. One of the contractors was on his knees near the gangway, measuring the tilt with a level, and another was whispering into his phone with the kind of voice people use when they know payment is about to become a problem. Brenda stepped closer and lowered her tone again, trying to bring the moment back under her control. She said we did not need outsiders involved. She said misunderstandings happen during large community projects. She said if there had been a paperwork issue, the board could resolve it quietly. Quietly. That word almost made me smile. There had been nothing quiet about the way they built this thing. They posted renderings at the clubhouse. They mailed glossy invitations with watercolor sketches of couples dining over sunset reflections. They hired a string quartet for the launch. They even had valet signs stacked by the entrance in the gravel lot, as if enough staging could make trespassing look elegant. When I first saw the flyer on my mailbox 3 weeks earlier, I had to read it twice just to believe the nerve of it. Moonlight Cove Floating Bistro. Locally sourced menu. Lakeside fine dining. Exclusive opening night for residents and invited guests. They had turned my Shoreline into a brand before they ever got permission, because somewhere in Brenda's mind, ownership was just an inconvenience for people with less confidence. I remembered walking straight from the mailbox to my office, pulling the deed file from the bottom drawer, and laying out every page across the desk where my father used to balance invoices for bait, dock lumber, and tax bills. The old survey map still had his penciled notes in the margin, the Eastern Bank marker, the spillway line, the mechanical release access point. All of it clear, dated, recorded, and boring in the exact way good legal truth usually is. I sent copies that same afternoon, first by email, then by certified mail when no one responded. Brenda answered 4 days later with a paragraph that thanked me for my passion and assured me the board had reviewed all relevant access assumptions. Access assumptions. That was the phrase she used before historical access traditions, as if swapping one polished lie for another made her smarter instead of more reckless. The reporter had reached the edge of the lot by then, notebook in hand, camera operator trailing behind her boots on the gravel. I saw Brenda's shoulders lift with one long breath. She was about to perform. I knew the signs by then. The softened expression, the measured posture, the concerned civic tone. She was going to make this sound like an unfortunate environmental fluctuation and me like a difficult landowner refusing to cooperate with progress. But the problem with that version was standing all around her. The exposed mud, the sagging deck, the extension cords running over private shoreline, the launch banner hanging over failure. She looked at me one last time before the reporter arrived, and there was something new in her face now. Not guilt, not humility, just the first sharp edge of fear. Because for the first time since she started this project, she understood that the lake was not the only thing that had dropped overnight. The reporter introduced herself before Brenda could get a single polished sentence fully assembled, and that alone changed the air. You could feel it. A minute earlier this had still been a private disaster dressed in cream linen and string lights. Now it was a story. A camera came up on one shoulder. A microphone appeared. One simple question landed in the middle of the wreck like a dropped anchor. Who owns the water under this structure? Brenda opened her mouth with that practiced half-smile she used whenever she wanted to sound calm and authoritative at the same time, but the answer did not come out clean. She started with the neighborhood, then the board, then shared use, then community access, and every word sounded thinner than the one before it. I stood there listening to her build another bridge out of language while the real one behind her sagged lower into the mud. The morning had gone bright by then, and daylight was doing what legal letters and warnings had failed to do. It was exposing every shortcut. From where I stood, I could see the temporary power lines stretched too low across the bank, the unmarked fuel can near the service ramp, the decorative planters already leaning because the platform beneath them was no longer level. A county vehicle rolled into the gravel lot just as the reporter asked whether permits had been issued for commercial use on privately controlled water. That was the sound Brenda heard before anything else, tires crunching over stone, and I watched her entire posture tighten. Not because she had suddenly developed respect for boundaries, but because official eyes were arriving faster than she could manage the narrative. 2 inspectors stepped out wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards, the kind of men who do not care about ribbon cuttings, brochure language, or homeowner politics. They care about files, measurements, signatures, and whether somebody was foolish enough to confuse momentum with permission. One of them asked who was in charge of the installation. Brenda raised her hand with a confidence that looked forced now, and for the first time that morning, several of the contractors looked relieved to let her own it. That told me more than their invoices ever could. They knew who had pushed this. They knew who had insisted the launch date mattered more than the paperwork. And they knew the tide had turned. One inspector walked toward the gangway, stopped, and frowned at the exposed support points. The other crouched near the shoreline, looking at the temporary line route and the disturbed bank where crews had driven equipment in and out all week. He asked who had authorized the shoreline access. Brenda started talking again, but this time he cut in and asked for parcel numbers. Not renderings. Not board resolutions. Parcel numbers. I could have thanked him for that. The truth always gets sharper when somebody asks the boring question the right liar hoped no one would mention. Brenda glanced at me then, just once, and I saw it clearly. She was trying to decide whether to keep bluffing or start bargaining. That was the moment I remembered the Thursday night she had me escorted out of the clubhouse after I laid the survey on the refreshment table in front of everyone. She had smiled while doing it too, as if humiliating me on my own evidence would teach me my place. She told the room I was obstructing progress. She said private anxieties should not stand in the way of community development. People clapped for her. I can still hear it, those little applause bursts under fluorescent lights while she folded my certified letter in half and set it aside like junk mail. Standing there now, with her project tilted and county inspectors measuring what the lake had revealed, I realized something almost peaceful. I did not need revenge to feel big. I only needed the truth to stay standing longer than her confidence. The inspector on the bank straightened up and asked the question I had been waiting weeks to hear out loud. If this is private water control territory, who has the release authority? Brenda did not answer. She looked at me. For a second, nobody moved. The inspectors looked at me. The reporter looked at me. Even the contractors who had spent the last hour pretending they were only hired hands suddenly found something very interesting about the shoreline in my direction. The only sound was the faint tick of cooling metal from a portable grill somebody had wheeled onto the service deck before dawn, and beneath that, the slow wet drip of lake water falling off pontoons that had no business sitting on my property in the first place. Brenda said my name the way people do when they are trying to turn familiarity into leverage. Ethan. Just that. Soft, careful, almost reasonable. But I had heard too many versions of that voice already. I had heard it in board meetings when she called me passionate but misinformed. I had heard it in emails where she thanked me for my input and ignored every attachment, proving her project had no right to exist. I had heard it the day she stood in the clubhouse parking lot with 3 board members behind her and told me that if I kept obstructing neighborhood improvements, the association would review my compliance status across all visible property lines. That was Brenda's style. She never needed to shout. She preferred the polished threat, the kind wrapped in policy language and delivered with a smile meant for witnesses. I reached into my truck and pulled out the blue document folder I had brought that morning, not because I expected anyone to suddenly grow honest, but because I knew truth works best when it arrives already organized. The paper felt cool in my hand. The county seal on the top copy caught the light. I handed the first page to the inspector nearest me, then the survey map, then the deed addendum listing water control authority, shoreline access restrictions, and maintenance rights retained by my family when the surrounding acreage was split and sold years before the subdivision ever existed. No easement. No commercial use transfer. No common element conversion. No board discretion. Just the kind of plain legal language that looks boring until somebody builds a dining deck on top of it. The inspector read in silence, then handed the next page to his partner. The reporter leaned in enough to catch the header, and I could see the story rearranging itself behind her eyes. This was no longer a quirky launch day mishap. This was a neighborhood power play sitting on top of recorded property law. Brenda stepped forward and said the board had relied on long-standing community access patterns, and the inspector did not even look up when he answered that customary use does not override recorded control rights. That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. You could hear the air leave the morning. One contractor muttered a curse under his breath. Somebody from catering quietly closed the back doors of the van as if folding up hope. Brenda's face did not collapse all at once. It tightened in stages. First disbelief, then calculation, then the cold anger of someone realizing the room has stopped accepting her version of events. She asked whether lowering the water had been necessary, and that was the first honest question she had asked all month. I told her I had sent notice 14 days earlier that unauthorized structures needed to be removed from the controlled basin before a scheduled water level adjustment tied to seasonal management. I told her the certified receipt was in the folder. I told her I had not hidden a thing. She had just mistaken warning for weakness. The inspector found the notice letter, checked the date, and nodded once. Then he looked at the restaurant half settled in the mud, the improvised power run across the bank, the launch banners fluttering over a project with no legal ground beneath it, and said the words Brenda had spent weeks outrunning. Shut it down until ownership and permitting are verified. And standing there on the shoreline my grandfather once measured by hand, I realized the sweetest part was not that I had been right. It was that everyone else had finally heard it from somebody Brenda could not talk over. The words shut it down did something no warning letter, no survey map, and no argument at a board meeting had managed to do. They made everyone step back from Brenda at the same time. It was subtle at first. One contractor unclipped his radio and stopped answering her. A caterer began loading stainless steel trays back into the van without waiting for instruction. The violinist they had hired for the evening launch, who had shown up early for rehearsal in a navy coat and polished shoes, quietly lifted his case from a folding chair and carried it toward the lot like he already understood there would be no music here today. And through all of it, Brenda kept standing there on the sloped dock, holding her phone like it was still a badge of authority instead of a piece of glass with no power left in it. The morning sun had climbed high enough to hit the exposed bands on the old cedar depth post near the bank, and I caught myself staring at those marks for a second. 4 feet. 5 feet. 6. My father painted those measurements by hand when I was 16, standing barefoot in a John boat, while I steadied the ladder and mosquitoes hummed over the water. He told me those marks mattered because someday someone would claim they did not know where the line was, how deep the basin ran, or who controlled the level. He said memory was good, but records were better, and visible records were better still. Looking at that post now, with 6 feet of truth showing in plain daylight, I understood exactly what he meant. Brenda finally turned back to the inspectors and tried one last pivot. She said the structure could be reclassified. She said the board had acted in good faith. She said the neighborhood had already sold opening night reservations and invested substantial community funds. Her voice was still steady, but now it had that dry, strained quality people get when they are talking too fast to outrun the facts. One inspector wrote something on his clipboard and asked for the names of every board member who voted on the installation. The other asked who approved the temporary electrical run and whether a shoreline disturbance notice had been filed. Brenda did not answer either question right away. She looked toward the parking lot where a few residents had gathered near the entrance, still dressed for a launch party that was never coming, whispering as they checked the giant sign and then looked back at the tilted platform in the mud. That was when the mood changed again. Until then, this had still been Brenda versus me, power versus paperwork, confidence versus proof. But once the residents started hearing words like control rights, private basin, unauthorized access, and commercial use, it stopped being my dispute and started becoming their betrayal. I saw one man pull the invitation card from his jacket pocket and stare at it like he had just realized he had been handed a ticket to someone else's property. A woman in a pale blue sweater asked out loud whether HOA dues had paid for the structure. Nobody answered her. They did not need to. The silence around that question was answer enough. Brenda heard it too. Her chin lifted a fraction, and for the first time since sunrise, she looked less like a president and more like a person stranded in the ruins of her own certainty. I did not gloat. I did not need to. The lake had already done the speaking for me. All I did was close the document folder, tuck it under my arm, and watch the truth spread across that shoreline one witness at a time, because that is the part people never understand about real justice. It is not the moment your enemy panics. It is the moment everyone else stops believing them. By late morning, the shoreline felt less like a launch site and more like the scene after a storm that everyone had been warned about, but nobody believed would actually hit. The white linens were gone. The catering trays had disappeared. The musicians had left without ever opening their cases. All that remained were the bones of Brenda's ambition sitting crooked in the mud, the gold launch banner fluttering above a platform no one would step on now, and a growing circle of residents who had come for a luxury debut and ended up watching a legal collapse in real time. The inspectors moved methodically, taking photographs, reading parcel references, measuring where the temporary gangway crossed onto my bank, and marking each point with the kind of calm precision that makes panic look foolish. Brenda kept trying to insert herself back into the center of the conversation, but every time she spoke, somebody asked for a document she did not have. Permit number, easement filing, commercial use approval, electrical authorization, shoreline disturbance notice. It was like watching someone reach into drawer after drawer and come up empty while insisting the house still belonged to them. The reporter had stopped asking dramatic questions by then. She did not need them. The facts had become interesting enough on their own. One of the residents, a man I recognized from the neighborhood tennis court, asked whether HOA dues had paid for the floating platform. Another asked whether the board had insurance for unauthorized construction. A woman near the valet sign said she had bought 2 opening night tickets for her anniversary dinner and wanted to know who was issuing refunds. That word refunds hung in the air like a bad smell. You could almost hear the project turning from fantasy into liability. Brenda finally tried a different tactic. She said the board had acted on consultant advice and that operational details were still being finalized. That might have worked if the structure had not been visibly embedded in 6 feet of exposed basin and wired across a private shoreline under county inspection. But timing had turned against her. Every delay, every ignored letter, every little performance she staged to make me look unreasonable had led to this exact morning. And now the details she thought she could smooth over were the only things anyone cared about. I walked past the cedar depth post and down toward the east bank where the old steel release housing sat under its weathered cover, locked again, quiet again, doing what it had always done without applause. My grandfather used to say the strongest systems are the ones people forget are there until they need them. That line came back to me as I looked at the lake bed, the dark ridges of silt, the stranded platform, the trampled shoreline where crews had spent weeks pretending they were building the future. They were not building anything lasting. They were borrowing certainty from a woman who had confused position with power. Behind me, I heard one inspector explain that all commercial activity on the structure was suspended pending review and that any continued occupancy could trigger additional violations. There it was. Not just embarrassment now. Consequences. Real ones. The kind that keeps showing up after the cameras leave. Brenda said my name again, but this time there was no polish in it, no community language, no practiced authority, just frustration stripped bare by daylight. I turned, and she asked me how far I intended to take this. I looked from her to the half-sunken restaurant, to the residents whispering over invitations and invoices, to the county markings now clipped along the edge of my shoreline, and I realized the answer had been in front of her from the beginning. I was not the one who kept pushing this further. She was. All I had done was stop letting her use my lake as the stage for it. By noon, the county trucks were still in the lot, the reporter was still collecting names, and Brenda Collins was finally learning what silence sounds like when it does not belong to you anymore. It was not dramatic. That was the part one appreciated most. No shouting. No last-minute miracle. No rescue from the board members who had spent weeks nodding behind her at meetings while she sold my shoreline like it was a blank page waiting for her signature. One by one, they stopped answering calls. One by one, the people who had stood close to her when the brochures went out started drifting toward the edges of the crowd, avoiding eye contact, pretending they had only ever been observers. The structure stayed where it was, tilted deep in the exposed basin like the truth had pinned it there for everyone to study. The launch banner kept snapping in the wind above empty air. A champagne bucket lay on its side near the gangway, half sunk in the mud, and every now and then a breeze carried the mixed smell of lake silt, cut lumber, stale citrus, and the sharp electric heat of equipment that had been shut down too late to matter. One inspector handed Brenda a packet and explained the next steps in the flat, patient tone officials use when they know the argument phase is over. Suspension of activity. Review of unauthorized installation. Documentation requests. Potential fines. Potential civil exposure. She tried to ask a question halfway through, but he kept speaking. That may have been my favorite moment of the whole day. Not because she was being humiliated, but because for once she had to stand still and receive consequences in complete sentences. A few residents were doing the same math by then. Refunds, legal fees, HOA reserve funds, special assessments, insurance exclusions. I could hear the pieces clicking together in whispered fragments across the gravel lot. The neighborhood had not invested in a beautiful new amenity. They had financed a trespass with lighting. And now the bill was coming due. Brenda came over to me one last time while the inspectors photographed the shoreline markers. She had taken off the blazer by then and folded it over one arm, like maybe removing the costume would somehow make her seem more human. But she did not apologize. People like Brenda almost never do. She asked whether this could have been handled differently. I looked past her to the old cedar depth post, to the steel release housing on the east bank, to the black bands of wet earth slowly darkening as the basin settled, and I thought about every chance she had already been given. The letters, the meetings, the maps, the warnings, the way she laughed when I told her ownership was not a suggestion. So I told her the truth. It could have been handled differently the first time I said no. She stared at me for a second like she wanted to argue, but there was nowhere left to stand that was still hers. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned, the camera crews packed up, and the lake began to feel like itself again. Quiet, watchful, honest. The fake elegance was gone. All that remained was water, mud, cedar, and a broken idea sinking under the weight of its own arrogance. I stayed until the sun moved low enough to burn gold across the remaining surface, and when I finally turned toward my truck, I heard nothing behind me except reeds moving in the wind and a loose lantern tapping softly against an empty rail. My grandfather used to say that the land remembers who respects it. Standing there on my own shoreline, with the county record finally catching up to the truth my family had kept for generations, I understood exactly what he meant. Justice is not loud. It does not need a stage, and it does not ask permission from people who mistake power for ownership. It waits. It keeps records. And when the moment comes, it lowers the water just enough for everybody to see what was buried underneath.